Welcome to Chess Corner channel. Your basic guide to play chess. First, is the chessboard. It consists of 64 squares but in alternate colors, and that is the dark and light squares. The first square to your left is always the dark and the last square to your right is light, regardless if playing the white or black pieces. The board uses algebraic notation that records each movement per piece in a game, that way everyone can follow which square was the last move made by each player and what piece was moved to a specific square in a game. This also helps player review their games after a match by going back to the board and replay each move using these notations. If you fill all squares with these number and letter notations from A to H and 1 to 8, it should look like this. All squares along horizontal or rows are called your ranks, while all squares along vertical or columns are your files. Notice that A, C, E, and G files have the same alternate square colors, and vice versa for B, D, F and H files. The king. This is the most important piece of the game and the main target for both players. Once it is captured through checkmate, then the game is over. The notation is K. The queen, the strongest piece in the game with long range of movement, both diagonal and straight lines, with a value of 9 points. The notation is Q. The rook, second strongest piece to your queen with long range of movement but limited to straight lines from horizontal and vertical, with a value of 5 points. The notation is R. The bishop, a minor piece with movement on diagonal squares but limited to its square color, with a value of 3 points. The notation is B. The knight, a minor piece with movement on L-shaped pattern different from the other pieces as it can jump over any piece on the board, with a value of 3 points. The notation is N. The pawn, the lowest rank among the pieces and can only move in a forward direction and can never go back like the other pieces, with a value of 1 point. The notation is any from the letter A to H depending on its current location on the board. There are only main 6 pieces, but most pieces are doubled from rook, bishop, and knight, while pawn has 8 pieces total and the king and queen are 1 piece each. Therefore both sides have total of 16 pieces to start with. This is how it looks when in starting position. If you are playing white, your king will always in the dark square E1, and vice versa if black, your king in light square position E8. As always, the white goes to make the first move in every game, giving white the advantage at the start. The pawns at its original position can move 2 squares forward, after that it can move 1 square at a time. If at first it moved 1 square from its position, then succeeding moves will be 1 square at a time and could no longer move 2 squares forward. The way it captures an enemy piece is any piece along its diagonal squares. Take note that a pawn cannot move forward if an enemy piece or an ally piece is obstructing the square in front. It should be a free square without any piece occupying such square. If a pawn successfully reached the last rank without being captured, then you can promote your pawn to a higher piece from knight, bishop, rook or queen. The rook can move in any straight line regardless of color and number of squares. It cannot move if obstructed by its own ally pieces. If obstructed by an enemy piece, it has the option to capture if necessary or needed to create an advantage or a threat of checkmate to your opponent's king. So the rook way of capturing an enemy piece is by its way of movement itself. The knight, as mentioned earlier, moves through L-shaped pattern, 2 squares from original position, and can turn right or left square as its final destination. The knight's way of capturing an enemy piece is by its way of movement itself. The bishop can only move diagonally, and as per its square color. If at light square, then only at light diagonal squares, and if dark, then only at dark diagonal squares. It cannot move if obstructed by its ally pieces at its diagonal path. The bishop's way of capturing an enemy piece is by its way of movement itself, which is any enemy piece along its diagonal site. The queen, it can cover both diagonal to horizontal and vertical squares regardless of color and number of squares. It's like a combination of two bishops and rook way of movement. The queen's way of capturing an enemy piece is by its way of movement itself. The king, it can cover both diagonal to horizontal and vertical squares regardless of color but limited to one square at a time per move, not like the queen that it can move more than one square. The king's way of capturing an enemy piece is by its way of movement itself as long as it is not supported.